Well, hello again. I actually have a handout to give you. So if we have some kind souls. Oh, thank you. Wait a minute, let me keep one copy.
You want to keep a copy?
Yeah. You might also, in addition to the handout, you might also want to have your Sidurim open to page 205 so that you can see the contemporary version of Aleinu on page 205 and 206. So I hope that won't be too much juggling. And I'll tell you now, I'm not davening Musaf. So let me tell you about the first time that I was in shul and saw somebody spitting on the floor. Actually, it was probably the first and the only time I saw somebody spit on the floor in a synagogue. And no, it wasn't because somebody was singing Paul Simon's Me and Julio down by the schoolyard. It was sometime early in my college years, and I was davening in a service that included some Lubavitchers, some Chabad Hasidim. During Aleinu, we got to a certain line in the prayer, one which I hadn't grown up hearing or singing, which didn't appear in any conservative prayer book, but with which I was already minimally familiar. And when he arrived at that line, one of the Lubavitchers spit on the floor. And that was the beginning of the end of my infatuation with Chabad. Now, don't get me wrong, I was and I remain grateful for the place that Chabad Hasidism had in my Jewish journey, but I never really drank the Kool-Aid, or the vodka, as the case may be, and the spitting on the floor incident was a pivotal moment in my evolving Jewish perspective. It wasn't just the spitting that I found off-putting. I knew why that guy spat on the floor. As I said, I was familiar with the line that was the impetus for his zealous expectoration. And at the time, it was that line in Aleinu that offended me as much as the loogie on the floor. You won't find the offending line here on page 205 or anywhere in Sidur Lev Shalem, but it is here in the handout. You see there, it's sort of highlighted by some little formatting details. Aleinu l'shabeach la'adon hakol. It is our duty to praise the Master of all, latet gedula le'yotzer bereshit, to ascribe greatness to the Creator of the universe. Shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, who did not make us like the other nations of the lands. Velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama, and did not place us like the families of the earth. Shelo sam chelkenu kahem, who did not assign our portion like theirs. V'goralenu kechol hamonam, nor our lot like all of the multitudes. Now, all of that is familiar to you so far because we sing it or we mumble it. We say it numerous times every day traditionally. But here's the other part, line 7. Shehem mishtachavim lahevel varik, for they worship vanity and emptiness, umit palalim el lo yoshia, and pray to a God who cannot save. And as the footnotes tell you, that phrase hevel varik is taken from Isaiah 30, and the assertion that somebody prays to a God who cannot save, that's from Isaiah chapter 45. And then we go back to the stuff that's more familiar to you and me. V'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim. We bend the knee and bow and worship. Lifnei melech malchei hamalachim hakadosh baruch hu. Before melech malchei hamalachim, the kadosh baruch hu. Melech malchei hamalachim. If you look at the footnote, you'll see the origin of it in the book of Daniel. In the book of Daniel, the phrase melech malchei hamalachim, well, malchei hamalachim means the King of Kings. There's a Cecil B. DeMille movie from 1927, I believe, called King of Kings, but that's not about this. King of Kings. That's a different King of Kings. Melech Malchei Hamalachim, the King of Kings. So where does that strange phrase come from? Well, here's that little verse from Daniel, in which Daniel is trying to flatter Nebuchadnezzar. and he calls Nebuchadnezzar Melech Malchaya, which is Aramaic for Malchei HaMalachim, the king of kings. So if Nebuchadnezzar, the great king, or the king of the biggest, most powerful empire in the neighborhood at the time, if he's the king of kings, then the Kadosh Baruch Hu is even higher, the king of kings. How's it translated here? The supreme sovereign. Well, that's a felicitous figurative translation. So anyway, that's Ashrei, the parts that we're familiar with, and these two lines that we're less familiar with. The so-called offending lines are 7 and 8 in the handout, and at first glance, it's the lines themselves, not just the spitting, that many people might find offensive. And yet, Aleinu is such an important and central prayer in our prayer lives. Originally part of the Musaf service for Rosh Hashanah, it became so meaningful for Jews that later it was included in the Musaf service for Yom Kippur as well. And eventually, it became one of the concluding prayers for almost all of our services, weekdays, Shabbat, and holidays, morning, afternoon, and evening. But it's not only lines 7 and 8 that are problematic. Look at the rest of the first paragraph. God did not make us like the other nations of the lands, and did not place us like the families of the earth, did not assign our portion like theirs, nor our lot like all the multitudes. Yay for us, boo for all the other people. Now that might be a little harsh. After all, the prayer is mostly yay for God, praising and thanking God for giving us this unique path to God that today we call Judaism. But there's no denying the particularism of the first half of Aleinu, the part that you find on page 205 in Sidur Lev Shalem, in contrast to the universalism of the second half that you find on page 206. In his commentary on Aleinu in the 1998 Sidur Sim Shalom for Shabbat and festivals, Rabbi Leonard Kahan, Zichrono Livracha, writes, Aleinu contains two complementary ideas. The first paragraph celebrates the distinctiveness of the Jewish people and its unique faith in God. The second speaks eloquently of our universalist hope that someday God will be worshipped by all humanity. First part is particularistic, second part is universal. Well, with all due respect to my rabbinic mentor of so long ago, I have to disagree with Rabbi Kahan's characterization of the second half of Aleinu. It doesn't seem so universalistic to me. Or to put it another way, it strikes me as universalistically particularistic. I had to practice that. When you coin a new phrase, you have to make sure you can pronounce it correctly. Universalistically particularistic. The first half of Aleinu affirms that our religion is the right one, and the second half envisions the day when the whole world will recognize that our religion is the right one. Of course, most religions, at least the ones that have their origins in the pre-modern world, go through a stage in which they view themselves as the right one. And Judaism is no exception. Though most contemporary Jews might no longer hold this opinion, perhaps Aleinu offers us an opportunity to do a bit of the time traveling that Franz Rosenzweig wrote about, an opportunity to be with our ancestors, to commune with our ancestors, and to share with them some theological beliefs that they held, even if we do not. But this explanation solves our problem only partly, and for many of us, insufficiently. Communing with our ancestors is all well and good, but their apparent chauvinism is still problematic. Now let's turn back to those controversial lines in Aleinu. There are 7 and 8. For they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. Who is the they, and who is the God who cannot save? Well, to answer this question, we have to ask another question. When was Aleinu written? And nobody knows for sure. There's a traditional belief that Aleinu was written by Joshua in the Bible, that Joshua, after entering Jericho. According to this theory, when Joshua and the Israelites entered the Holy Land and were then surrounded by pagans, Joshua was judgmental about the pagan worship of the sun and constellations, and all the more appreciative of the Israelite worship of one incorporeal God. But there are a number of problems with the Joshua theory, including the fact that, as we saw, the prayer cites 2 verses from Isaiah, who lived centuries after Joshua. And there are other linguistic features that suggest that Aleinu was written long after Joshua. Contemporary scholars have different theories of the authorship of Aleinu. Rabbi Reuven Hammer, Zichrono Livracha, for example, writes that it is thought to have originated during the Maccabean period in the 2nd century BCE. At that time, the conflict between Judaism and Hellenism, with its elaborate pagan belief, was at its height. So that's another contemporary explanation for the origin of Aleinu. Now, figuring out roughly when Aleinu was written is important, especially in view of what started to happen in the Middle Ages. Rabbi Lawrence Hoffman reports that the line was interpreted by some medieval Jews to denote Christians and Muslims. We're putting down Christians and Muslims. Ismar Elbogen, the father of contemporary scholarship of Jewish liturgy, reports that around the year 1400, a Jewish apostate informed on the Jews, saying that these words refer to Jesus, as proved by the fact that the word varik, and empty, is numerically equivalent to 316, the same as, wait for it, Yeshu, Jesus. Varik, empty, 316. Yeshu, Jesus, 316. So clearly, this prayer is denigrating Jesus. Well, the gematria-based proof is a bit of a stretch, but the assertion that the Jews were denigrating Jesus found receptive ears in the medieval Christian church, which used this assertion and countless others to oppress medieval Jews. This anti-Semitic assertion resurfaced frequently over the centuries, and Hoffman reports that in the 16th century, Jacob ben Elijah of Venice again fought off the charge by citing the traditional view that Joshua had composed Aleinu in biblical days against the Canaanites, who worshiped idols and bowed down low to vanity and emptiness 2,000 years before Jesus of Nazareth was born. So the Joshua theory, while historically suspect, might have been politically useful. We're not denigrating you Christians and Muslims. We're denigrating those ancient Canaanites, so it's okay. But this indictment of Judaism persisted, and in Prussia in 1703, the government issued an edict concerning the Jewish prayer, which required that Aleinu be recited aloud. And officials were appointed whose job it was to visit the synagogue and supervise the enforcement of the edict's provisions. So if the law says you have to say Aleinu out loud, and you know there are going to be Christian spies in Shul, maybe you're more inclined not to say that line, perhaps not to say it at all. Well, not surprisingly, this line was censored from European prayer books, and it remains absent from most contemporary prayer books. The issue is how we feel about a line that asserts that they, whoever they are, worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a powerless God. And my guess is that most contemporary Jews would oppose the return of this line to our prayers. But I want to suggest to you that there is something paradoxically appropriate about including the line in Aleinu, and something problematic about continuing to exclude it. Let's look again at the Aleinu text in the handout, beginning with line 3. Who did not make us like the other nations of the lands, and did not place us like the families of the earth, who did not assign our portion like theirs, nor our lot like all the multitudes. For they, the multitudes, for they worship vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who cannot save. Lines 7 and 8 tell us why we might consider our religion superior to other religions. Or to put it in slightly less judgmental terms, why we take particular pride in our religion. And ironically, omitting these lines might make the prayer seem more chauvinistic. Rabbi Hammer writes, omitting them tends to give the impression that the Aleinu teaches that we are both different and better than others. The actual intent is to say that we are thankful that God has enlightened us so that, unlike the pagans, we worship the true God and not idols. There is no inherent superiority in being Jewish, Rabbi Hammer writes, but we do assert the superiority of monotheistic belief over paganism. No, I'm not suggesting that we return these controversial lines to our regular recitation of Aleinu. That ship has sailed. Right or wrong, accurately or mistakenly, these lines have taken on the negative connotation that they have, and including them in our daily prayers today would be objectionable to many non-Jewish guests in our synagogues, and certainly to many Jews as well. But even without these lines, Aleinu remains a problematic prayer. It does assert, albeit subtly, that we cherish our own religious tradition over others. And I don't think that's so terrible. There's a fine line between pride and chauvinism. There's nothing wrong with pride. And maybe that's why this originally Rosh Hashanah prayer became so prominent in our daily prayers all year round. Aleinu gives us the frequent occasion, every morning, afternoon, and evening. Aleinu gives us the frequent occasion to unabashedly assert our pride in our Jewishness and in Judaism, pride in our unique religious tradition, pride in our unique theology and values, pride in our unique relationship with God. But at the same time, Aleinu can challenge us to confront our own particularism, that fine line between pride and chauvinism, and to struggle with both the particularism and the universalism that are central in our contemporary Jewish identities and in contemporary Judaism. That struggle is complicated, and it's necessary. It is our theological burden, and it is our spiritual opportunity. Shabbat Shalom.